Picture a coin so small it could hide under your thumbnail. A coin worth 5 cents the day it was struck. And yet, a single example of this coin, one tiny disc of silver, has sold for more money than most people's first house. This is the story of the 1921 Canadian 5-cent piece. Collectors don't just call it rare. They call it the Prince of Canadian Coins. Today, on Coin Legacy, we're going to take this coin apart piece by piece, the obverse, the reverse, the history that almost erased it from existence, and the strange twist of fate that turned a common coin into one of the greatest rarities in the entire hobby. Stay with me. This one is worth it. To understand the 1921 5-cent piece, you first have to understand the world it was born into. The year is 1921. The First World War has been over for less than 3 years. Canada, still a young confederation, still finding its identity as a dominion of the British Empire, is rebuilding. Soldiers are coming home. The economy is unsteady. And quietly, behind the scenes, the Department of Finance and the Ottawa Mint are wrestling with a much smaller problem, the humble nickel. For decades, Canada's 5-cent coin had been struck in sterling silver, just like its larger cousins, the dime, the quarter, and the half-dollar. It was a tiny coin, barely larger than a shirt button, about 15.5 millimeters across, and so thin and lightweight that Canadians had given it an affectionate nickname, the fish scale. Slip one into a pocket full of other change, and you could lose it without even noticing. Drop one on a wooden floor, and it would skitter away like a sliver of ice. By the early 1920s, the Canadian government had made a decision. The 5-cent piece would no longer be struck in silver. It would be struck in pure nickel, larger, heavier, more durable, and instantly distinguishable by touch alone, even by someone who couldn't see it. This was partly about cost, partly about durability, and partly about practicality for a growing, modernizing economy. The new nickel coin would debut in 1922, in the size and style that many collectors would recognize even today. But that transition didn't happen overnight. And it's that in-between moment, the year before the changeover, that gives us our coin, the silver 5-cent piece dated 1921. On paper, it should have been a forgettable, ordinary year of coinage. The Ottawa Mint struck a respectable number of these coins, more than 2.5 million pieces, to be precise. By any normal measure, that's not a small mintage. Most coins with mintages in the millions become common, inexpensive pieces that fill bargain bins at coin shows for the rest of their existence. This one didn't. What happened next is one of the strangest and most dramatic stories in all of Canadian numismatics. And to tell it properly, we need to look closely at the coin itself first, because every line, every word, every leaf stamped into that silver tells part of the story. Turn the coin over in your fingers, and the first thing that meets your eye is the obverse, the head's side, the side that carries the portrait of the reigning monarch. In 1921, that monarch was King George V, grandson of Queen Victoria, and at this point in his reign, a deeply familiar face to nearly 1 billion subjects scattered across the British Empire. He'd been on the throne since 1910. He would remain there until 1936. And his portrait, solemn, bearded, crowned, appeared on coinage from London to Ottawa to Delhi to Canberra. On this 5-cent piece, George V is shown in profile, facing to the left, wearing the imperial state crown. Look closely at that crown and you'll notice real artistic detail packed into a tiny space, the arched bands, the small jeweled crosses, the orb and cross finial rising from the top. It's a remarkably busy, ornate design for a coin barely the size of a modern dime. Below the crown, the king's face is rendered with a naturalistic, almost photographic attention to texture. Note the wave of his hair beneath the crown's brim, the fullness of his beard, and the heavy ceremonial robe draped over his shoulder, fastened with a decorative clasp near the collar. This is not a stylized, abstract royal image. It's a sculptural portrait, the kind of engraving work that draws on a long European tradition of coin and metal portraiture stretching back centuries. Surrounding the king's portrait, running along the inner edge of the coin, is the Latin inscription that crowned almost every British Empire coin of this era. Georgius V. de Gra Rex Etind Imp. Translated, that reads, George V, by the grace of God, King and Emperor of India. It's a phrase steeped in the politics of empire, a reminder that the British monarch in this period held not just the crown of the United Kingdom, but the title of Emperor of India as well, following Queen Victoria's assumption of that title back in 1876. You'll see this same Latin formula, with small variations, across coinage from nearly every corner of the British Empire during George V's reign. Notice, too, the small cross or Maltese cross-like symbol breaking up the inscription near the top of the coin, a decorative flourish common to coinage of this period, separating the start and end of the legend in an elegant, balanced way. The whole obverse is bordered by a fine beaded rim, a ring of tiny raised dots running around the very edge of the coin, just inside the rim itself. This beading wasn't just decorative. It served a practical purpose too, helping to protect the coin's design from wear as it jingled around in pockets, purses, and cash drawers for years, sometimes decades. This obverse design wasn't unique to the 5-cent piece, by the way. With small adjustments, a version of George V's portrait appeared across the entire Canadian silver coinage of the era. The dime, the quarter, and the half-dollar all carried variations of this same royal profile. It united the coinage of an entire nation under one unmistakable image, the same way it united coinage across dozens of other nations and territories that, in 1921, still answered to the British crown. Now flip the coin over, and the entire character changes. Where the obverse is regal and imperial, the reverse is almost botanical, a quiet, symmetrical design built around nature and national identity. At the very top of the reverse sits a crown, not worn by anyone, simply floating above the design, a symbol rather than a portrait. It's the same Tudor-style crown you'd find on coinage throughout the empire in this period, an arched, jeweled band beneath a domed top, capped with a small cross. Below the crown, in bold, simple lettering, the coin states its purpose plainly. 5 cents. Canada. No flourishes, no Latin, no ambiguity. This is a coin meant to be read at a glance, by anyone, in either of Canada's official languages, doing business at a corner shop or a train station ticket window. Beneath that lettering sits the date, 1921, flanked by a small decorative arrow-like flourish, a stylistic touch unique to this particular wreath design used on Canadian silver 5-cent pieces of the era. And then there's the wreath itself, easily the most visually striking element of the entire coin. 2 curving branches sweep up from a ribbon-tied bow at the bottom of the coin, arcing outward and upward on either side, almost embracing the crown above. Counted carefully, the design contains 22 individual leaves, rendered with fine, naturalistic veining, each leaf slightly different in its curve and angle, giving the wreath a sense of organic movement rather than rigid, mechanical symmetry. At the base, where the 2 branches meet, a neatly tied ribbon bow holds everything together, a small but lovely sculptural detail that art historians and coin engravers alike have long admired in Canadian coinage of this period. It's the kind of detail that's easy to miss at first glance, and yet, once you notice it, you can't stop noticing it every time you look at the coin again. This wreath-and-crown reverse design wasn't new in 1921. It had been used, with only minor modifications, on Canadian silver 5-cent pieces for years already, carrying forward a visual identity that Canadian coin users had grown completely accustomed to. Which makes what happened to this particular date, 1921, all the more remarkable. Because this familiar, unremarkable design was about to preside over one of the most dramatic disappearing acts in the history of Canadian coinage. Here is where our story takes its dramatic turn. As we mentioned earlier, the Canadian government had already decided, by the early 1920s, to abandon the silver 5-cent coin entirely in favor of a larger, pure nickel design debuting in 1922. That decision set off a chain reaction inside the Ottawa Mint that nobody in 1921 could have fully appreciated the consequences of. With a brand new coin format on the way, the Mint found itself sitting on large reserves of the old silver 5-cent pieces, coins struck in years like 1920 and 1921 that were now, in a sense, already obsolete before they'd even had a chance to fully circulate. Rather than let these older coins linger indefinitely in vaults and bank reserves, officials made a fateful decision: melt them down. And melt them down they did, in staggering numbers. Mint records indicate that more than 3 million silver 5-cent coins were melted in this period, recycled back into bullion to be reused, repurposed, or simply removed from circulation as the nation transitioned to its new nickel coinage. Here's the part that makes coin collectors' jaws drop. Generation after generation, the overwhelming majority of those melted coins were dated 1921. Think about that for a moment. The mint had struck over 2.5 million 1921 5-cent pieces, a perfectly healthy mintage by the standards of the day. And then, in what amounts to almost an act of accidental historical sabotage, the mint turned around and destroyed nearly that entire mintage before it had any real chance to enter wide circulation or end up tucked away in collections. Why did this happen specifically to the 1921 dated coins, rather than being spread evenly across other years? Numismatic historians point to simple bureaucratic logic. The most recently struck coins were the ones sitting closest to hand in mint and bank vaults, the easiest to gather up and melt in bulk. The 1921 coins, struck right before the production halt, were disproportionately represented in those reserve stockpiles, and so they were disproportionately represented in the melting pot. By the time the dust settled and the new nickel 5-cent coin debuted in 1922, a coin that had been minted by the millions just months earlier had effectively ceased to exist in any meaningful quantity. A handful of examples had already slipped into circulation before the melting began. A handful more survived because individual collectors, perhaps sensing something unusual, perhaps simply collecting by habit, had set examples aside as keepsakes the moment they appeared. Everything else vanished, melted back into nameless, dateless silver bullion. It's one of the only instances in Canadian numismatic history where the mint itself, through its own internal policy decisions, single-handedly created one of its own greatest rarities, not through low mintage, but through deliberate, large-scale destruction after the fact. So just how many 1921 silver 5-cent pieces survived this destruction? The consensus among numismatic researchers, auction houses, and grading services puts the number at roughly 400 surviving examples, across every condition, from heavily worn, barely readable circulated pieces all the way up to pristine, gem-quality survivors that somehow escaped circulation entirely. 400 coins. Out of an original mintage of over 2.5 million. That's a survival rate of well under 0.1%. To put that in perspective, if you gathered up every single surviving 1921 Canadian silver 5-cent piece in the world today, every one in private collections, museum cabinets, bank vaults, and safety deposit boxes combined, you could probably fit the entire group into a single shoebox. That's the size of the population we're talking about for one of the most valuable coins, by denomination, in the world. Third-party grading services, the professional companies that authenticate and grade coins for collectors, have together certified fewer than 100 examples across their combined populations, though that figure includes some coins resubmitted multiple times by owners chasing a higher grade. Even accounting for that, it confirms what the survival estimate already tells us: this is a coin that the vast majority of collectors, even serious, lifelong collectors, will never personally hold. This rarity has earned the coin its evocative nickname, the Prince of Canadian Coins. It's a title that deliberately echoes another legendary Canadian rarity from the very same year, the 1921 50-cent piece, a coin so scarce and so coveted that it's known, without irony, as the King of Canadian Coins. Strikingly, both of these legendary rarities, the King and the Prince, share the exact same birth year, 1921, both victims of similar mint-melting decisions during the same turbulent period of currency transition. It's almost as if 1921 became, by accident, the single most consequential year in 20th-century Canadian coinage history. And the condition story matters just as much as the raw survival numbers. Because the vast majority of the roughly 400 surviving examples are well-worn, heavily circulated pieces, coins that clearly spent years jingling through pockets and cash registers before anyone thought to set them aside. Truly high-grade, mint-state examples, coins that look essentially as fresh as the day they left the Ottawa Mint Press, are almost unimaginably scarce within an already minuscule population. Some specialists believe only a handful of genuinely uncirculated examples exist in the entire world. Numbers on a page can only tell you so much. Let's talk about what this rarity actually translates to at auction, because the figures are genuinely staggering for a coin whose face value is, quite literally, 5 cents. Even well-worn, heavily circulated examples, coins graded at levels collectors describe as good or fine, meaning visibly worn with softened details, routinely sell for several $1,000s. A coin in that kind of honest, working-class condition, the kind any other 5-cent piece from this era would be worth pocket change, can bring anywhere from roughly $2,000 to $7,000 or more, depending on the specifics of the sale. Move up into higher circulated grades, and the numbers climb quickly into the 5-figure range. Coins described by graders as extremely fine or low mint state have sold for $10,000 and beyond. And then there's the very top of the population, the small handful of coins that survived in near pristine, gem-quality condition. The single finest known example, certified by a leading professional grading service at one of the very highest grades ever assigned to this coin, sold at a major American auction house for a hammer price exceeding $100,000, and that figure doesn't even include the buyer's premium or applicable taxes that would have pushed the final total even higher. Some market reports and price guides on the lone finest specimens have suggested values that approach, or in certain estimates even exceed, the kind of numbers normally reserved for fine art or vintage automobiles, figures that have been cited in the hundreds of thousands of dollars for the absolute finest, most pedigreed example in existence. For a 5-cent coin. Struck for ordinary, everyday commerce. That gap between face value and market value, a gap measured not in dollars but in literally millions of percentage points, is exactly what makes the 1921 5-cent piece such an enduring obsession for serious collectors of Canadian coinage. Before we move into the world of counterfeits and collecting strategy, it's worth pausing on something easy to overlook, the physical specifications of this coin, because they tell their own small story. The 1921 5-cent piece was struck in 800 fine silver, meaning 80% silver, with the remaining 20% made up of base metal, typically copper, added for hardness and durability. That's a slightly lower silver purity than the sterling standard used in many other silver coins of the era, but it was the standard composition for Canadian silver 5-cent pieces throughout this period. The coin weighs only about 1 1/5 grams, feather light, even by the standards of small change. Its diameter measures roughly 15.5 millimeters, smaller across than a modern Canadian dime. And its edge is reeded, a series of fine, evenly spaced ridges running around the circumference, a security feature dating back centuries, originally designed to prevent unscrupulous people from shaving slivers of precious metal off the edge of a coin without anyone noticing. Hold one of these coins today, more than 100 years after it left the press, and you're holding a genuinely tiny, genuinely fragile object. It's easy to understand why so many were lost, worn smooth, or simply melted without a second thought. And it's exactly that fragility, combined with its dramatic survival story, that makes a well-preserved example feel almost miraculous in the hand. It's also worth understanding where this design came from, because it didn't appear out of nowhere in 1921. The obverse portrait of George V used on Canadian coinage traces back to engraving work produced for the broader British Empire coinage program in the early years of his reign, adapted for use across multiple dominions and colonies with only the inscriptions changing to reflect each issuing authority. This was standard practice for the era, a shared visual language of empire, where the same royal profile, struck from dies prepared under royal mint authority, would appear with only minor modifications on coins circulating from the Caribbean to South Africa to the Pacific. The reverse wreath-and-crown design, meanwhile, was a distinctly Canadian creation, used specifically for the silver 5-cent denomination across multiple years of George V's reign before the 1922 changeover to nickel. It's a design that Canadian collectors closely associate with this specific run of fish-scale coinage, small, silver, and now, largely because of 1921, the subject of considerable collector fascination. Together, the two sides of this coin represent a kind of design partnership common throughout this era, an imperial portrait on one side, anchoring the coin to the broader Commonwealth and Crown, and a distinctly national, almost botanical design on the other, anchoring the coin specifically to Canada and to the everyday commerce of Canadians using it at corner stores, post offices, and train stations throughout the early 1920s. Whenever a coin becomes this valuable, it inevitably attracts a darker shadow industry, counterfeiters and date alterers looking to profit from collector demand. Because the 1921 5-cent piece shares its exact size, weight, design, and silver composition with the much more common 1920 dated coin, a coin struck in the millions and worth only a tiny fraction of its rare cousin, unscrupulous individuals have, over the decades, attempted to alter genuine 1920 coins, carefully reworking the final digit of the date to mimic a 1. It's a forgery method that's been documented in Canadian numismatic circles for generations, precisely because the underlying coin, the size, the silver content, and the design are all otherwise completely authentic and correct, only the date has been tampered with. This is exactly why serious buyers of this particular coin almost always insist on professional, third-party authentication and grading before purchase. A coin encapsulated and certified by a reputable grading service has been examined under magnification by trained specialists looking precisely for the telltale signs of date alteration, disturbed metal flow around the digits, inconsistent tooling marks, or microscopic evidence of re-engraving. For a coin in this rarity and price bracket, that extra layer of verification isn't optional caution. It's an absolute necessity. Let's talk, for a moment, about the dream scenario every collector secretly imagines, finding a 1921 5-cent piece in an old jar of change, an inherited collection, or a forgotten drawer somewhere. It happens. Not often, but it happens, and it's exactly why this coin holds such a powerful grip on the imagination of casual collectors and seasoned numismatists alike. Because unlike a coin that was always known to be special from the moment it was struck, this one slipped quietly into ordinary circulation alongside millions of other unremarkable 5-cent pieces, and a small number of examples have genuinely turned up decades later in completely unexpected places, tucked into old coin albums, mixed into inherited collections, or sitting unnoticed in a roll of old Canadian silver. If you ever come across a Canadian 5-cent piece from this general era, the very first thing to do is check the date carefully. Remember, this coin shares its size and design with the far more common 1920 issue, so a careful, magnified look at that final digit matters enormously. Beyond that, resist the urge to clean it. Cleaning a coin, even gently, can strip away the natural toning and surface character that collectors and grading services look for, and can permanently reduce its value. The safest next step, always, is to have it examined by a knowledgeable dealer or submitted directly to a professional grading service for authentication. Given how few genuine examples exist, and given the well-documented history of date alterations in this specific series, that step of professional verification isn't just good practice. For this particular coin, it's essential. So why has this particular coin, more than a century after it was struck, continued to captivate collectors generation after generation? Part of it is simple math, the brutal arithmetic of an enormous original mintage reduced, almost entirely by accident, to a tiny surviving population. But part of it is something less tangible. There's a kind of poetry in a coin that was never meant to be special. The 1921 5-cent piece wasn't a commemorative issue. It wasn't struck in limited numbers on purpose, the way some special coins are deliberately made scarce from the very beginning. It was meant to be ordinary. It was meant to be spent, forgotten, and eventually worn smooth by decades of everyday Canadian commerce, just like every 5-cent coin before it. Instead, a bureaucratic decision made in a mint office, almost certainly without a second thought at the time, transformed an utterly mundane coin into one of the rarest and most desirable pieces in the entire field of Canadian numismatics. Every surviving example carries that strange, almost accidental history within it, a silent witness to a moment when an empire was still finding its modern shape, when a young dominion was redefining its own currency, and when a small, unassuming silver coin somehow slipped through the melting pot to tell the story today. That's the story of the 1921 Canadian 5-cent piece, the Prince of Canadian Coins. A coin born for pocket change, destroyed almost to extinction by its own mint, and resurrected by scarcity into one of the true legends of the hobby. If you enjoyed this deep dive, make sure you're subscribed to Coin Legacy for more documentaries on the rarest, strangest, and most fascinating coins in history. Drop a comment below and let me know, do you own a 1921 5-cent piece, or have you ever come across one at a show or in an old collection? I'd love to hear your stories. Until next time, keep collecting, keep learning, and I'll see you in the next episode.